Blood. That was all Mary Todd Lincoln could see. It covered her hands, her dress, as she paced the parlor room. Her husband of over 2 decades, the man she loved more than anything, had just been shot at Ford's Theater during a production of Our American Cousin. She couldn't understand what was happening. One moment, the couple was laughing along at something said during the play, and the next moment a loud shot rang out, and her husband slumped forward, unresponsive. He was brought across the street, laid across the bed at Peterson's boarding house, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead. Mary wasn't even allowed to be with her husband in the last moments of his life. Instead, she was cast aside, told that her emotions overwhelmed everyone. April 15th, 2025 will be the 165th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. She was told that she needed to take a breath, to calm down, that her hysterics were making the men in the room uncomfortable. This was a pretty consistent theme in Mary's life. She was considered to be one of the most unpopular first ladies in American history. Mary certainly had her faults, such as spending a lot of money on redecorating the White House during an incredibly expensive war. But she also suffered so much loss. Not only did she witness the horrendous assassination of her husband by a crazed murderer, she also lost 3 of her 4 sons. She struggled with mental illness. Sometimes her depression was so bad she couldn't get out of bed. Her life was marked by tragedy, and yet she was vilified for her behavior. She was not able to have the space and time to be able to grieve for the loss of her family members, but instead, every action was splashed across newspapers. Rarely able to have a moment of peace, to be able to process and feel the very powerful emotions that go along with losing loved ones. This is the story of Mary Todd Lincoln. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Mary was born December 13, 1818, to Robert S. Todd and Eliza Parker Todd in Lexington, Kentucky, the 4th of 7 children. Her paternal grandfather, Levi Todd, was one of the founders of Lexington. Robert Todd, her father, was, according to different sources, either a wealthy businessman, but I also read that he was a banker. Mary's mother died when Mary was just 6 years old. That was her first experience with death, but it would certainly not be her last. In 1826, when Mary was 8, her father remarried a woman named Elizabeth Humphreys, and they would go on to have 9 children together. Elizabeth and Mary did not get along. One time, her stepmother called her Satan's limb. Mary was tired of being under Elizabeth's strict rule, and so she frequently spent time with her grandmother. Mary later described her childhood as desolate. At this time, Lexington was considered the Athens of the West. However, over 93% of Black residents were enslaved individuals, and the Todd family was also slave owners. They benefited economically from using slave labor, including receiving income from renting out their slaves. While the Todd family claimed that their slaves were like family, I think to make that claim about people you own is deeply ignorant, frankly disingenuous, and disrespectful to those who were enslaved. According to a childhood friend, Mary was described as having an interesting personality, lively and impulsive. Quote, she now and then could not restrain a witty, sarcastic speech that cut deeper than intended. End quote. Mary was only 5'2" tall. She had blue eyes, light brown hair, and a clear complexion. And she had educational opportunities that many, including her later husband, did not have access to. At the age of 9, she attended Ward's Academy, and at the age of 14, she graduated to Madame Charlotte Mantel's French School for Girls, which was also a boarding school in Lexington. In 1839, she moved to Springfield, Illinois, to live with her sister Elizabeth and Elizabeth's husband, Ninian Edwards. Ninian's family was very active in local politics, his father being the former governor of Illinois. It was through their political circle that she likely met Abraham Lincoln. At the time, Lincoln was working as a lawyer in the countryside and was struggling. Mary had a pretty contemporary view of marriage and once said, quote, I would rather marry a poor man, a man of mind, with a hope and bright prospects ahead for position, fame, and power, than to marry all the houses of gold. End quote. This may have been what attracted Mary to Lincoln to begin with. After his death, she wrote, quote, there never existed a more loving, devoted husband. End quote. On November 4th, 1842, they got married. Some of her family did not approve of the marriage due to him being from a poor background. While their socioeconomic statuses differed, they shared political values and intellectual pursuits. The couple went on to have 4 children. Although her early years with her husband may have been joyful, their lives were ultimately defined by hardship and death that continued beyond the assassination. They had Robert Todd, Edward Baker, William Wallace, and Thomas Tad Lincoln. Sadly, little Edward, also known as Eddie, didn't even survive past his 3rd birthday and passed away from tuberculosis about a month before he was about to turn 4. The Lincolns spent 1847 to 1849 in Washington, D.C. for Lincoln's single term in Congress. In 1860, he ran for president and he won. He reportedly excitedly ran home to tell his wife, quote, Mary, Mary, we are elected, end quote. Mary immediately took to her First Lady duties. She liked the social aspect of it and would host balls and visit troops. Things were not easy for Mary, though. She was criticized by Southerners for being a traitor to her origins. Union supporters thought she was two-faced and accused her of committing treason. The Todd siblings were also divided on their loyalty. 6 of the siblings were Union supporters and 8 supported the Confederacy, either because they married into it or they had served military time for the Confederacy. One thing she did that was largely scrutinized was redecorating the interior of the White House due to wear and tear. She recarpeted the staterooms and bought expensive furniture. There was a lot of scrutiny from the press due to her lavish spending during an expensive war. That being said, she supported local contraband camps. Contraband camps were established by enslaved people who were escaping the South. These camps were set up in Union territory. She contributed money and sent gifts. As she was trying to raise funds for these camps, she wrote, quote, the immense number of contrabands are suffering intensely, many without bed covering and having to use any bit of carpeting to cover themselves, many dying of want, end quote. American journalist William Stoddard wrote about Mary visiting Union hospitals to visit and cheer up soldiers. Quote, she rarely takes outside company with her upon these errands, and she thereby loses opportunities. Is she worldly wise, she would carry newspaper correspondents from 2 to 5 of both sexes every time she went. Then she would bring the writers back to the White House and give them some cake and show them the conservatory, end quote. While going over budget while decorating during an expensive war may have not been the wisest decision, she did the best she felt that she could in supporting her country and her husband. She visited hospitals and comforted troops, and even traveled with Abraham to battlefields to boost morale. All this scrutiny was made much worse by the death of her son William, also known as Willie, in 1862 from typhoid fever, which was thought that he had contracted it from drinking contaminated water from the Potomac River. She was so distraught by the loss of her child that she couldn't even attend the funeral. The service took place in the East Room of the White House. Her friend Elizabeth Keckley said, quote, "Mrs. Lincoln's grief was inconsolable. The pale face of her dead boy threw her into convulsions." End quote. The loss of her nearly 12-year-old son sent her into a terrible depression. She was unable to leave her bed for months. Abraham hired a nurse to take care for her. The public seemed to have little empathy and compassion for Mary, as every day they were receiving news about the deaths of soldiers on the front lines. Parents who lose a child feel a myriad of emotions that can greatly affect their quality of life. Losing a child can result in severe anxiety, depressive symptoms, and can experience suicidal ideation. Parents who feel a sense of guilt that they were unable to protect their child. Typhoid was a disease that Dr. William Budd had discovered was transmitted via fecal matter in 1838, but it wasn't until 1880 that Carl Joseph Eberth was the first to describe the bacillus that caused the fever. It then took another 16 years before an effective vaccine was created by Elmroth Edward Wright. While other First Ladies had been virtually invisible to the public, Mary was determined not to melt into the background. She became the subject of vicious gossip and rumors in D.C. Her biographer, Catherine Clinton, said, quote, "Being under scrutiny as a fashion symbol, the First Lady's popularity was as precarious as a roller coaster ride, sometimes up and often down, with change in the blink of an eye. Her fastidious attention to matters of dress at first impressed and recommended her to the press. The rumored cost of her attire became the subject of Washington gossip and prompted bitter critiques by journalists, especially as Union soldiers fell by the thousands, maimed and wounded, dying in camp and on the battlefield." End quote. She had a lack of discretion when it came to her personal affairs as well as her spending habits. It seemed that Mary had a sense of naivete when it came to others trying to win her favor. Journalist Henry Villard observed that, quote, "She allowed herself to be approached and continuously surrounded by a common set, men and women, who, through her susceptibility to even the most barefaced flattery, easily gained a controlling influence over her." End quote. She privately had entertained visitors such as Senator Charles Sumner, Senator Ira Harris, journalist and spiritualist Nathaniel P. Willis. Quote, "Mrs. Lincoln's last beneficial act as a political partner was her tireless courtship of the liberal senator from Massachusetts. Playfully flirtatious but chaste. There was nothing insincere about Mary Lincoln's pursuit of Charles Sumner." End quote, wrote Lincoln scholar Daniel Mark Epstein. Despite her unusual friendships with other men and her jealousy towards her husband's attention to other women, they had a loving and strong relationship. Elizabeth Blair Lee, a family friend, said, quote, "Mary has her husband's deepest love. This is a matter upon which one woman cannot deceive another." End quote. As the Civil War raged on, Mary lost 3 of her half-brothers who fought on the Confederate side. Sam at the Battle of Shiloh, David at the Siege of Vicksburg, and Alec at the Battle of Baton Rouge. Although she told her friend and seamstress Elizabeth Keckley that her brother Alec, quote, "made his choice long ago. He decided against my husband, through him against me. He has been fighting against us, and since he chose to be our deadly enemy, I see no special reason why I should bitterly mourn his death." End quote. On July 3, 1863, she was thrown from her carriage and suffered from a head wound and likely a concussion due to this. A traumatic brain injury, also known as a TBI, can have long-term effects on the sufferer, and that includes lower cognitive function, such as trouble with memory or language. It can cause the sufferer to struggle with mood regulation, such as anxiety, depression, or anger. They can have difficulty sleeping and trouble with paying attention to things. They may have a hard time being able to filter environmental stimuli, and they may struggle with motor functions, coordinations, and sensory issues. This can occur years after the TBI had occurred. The Civil War was difficult on Lincoln and Mary's marriage. Historian Matthew Pinsker wrote, quote, "Frustrated by her private grief and poor health, 19th century gender conventions, and her husband's near constant state of exhaustion, the First Lady found it difficult to connect to him and support him in his enormous endeavors." end quote. Biographer Catherine Clinton said that by 1865, Mary, quote, had been all but excluded from his circle of trusted advisors because of her troubling mood swings, her prolonged absences, and her capricious behavior, end quote. In March of 1865, when she went on her trip to the Richmond front, she was struggling with her mental health. John S. Barnes, a naval officer, wrote that she, quote, was at no time well. The mental strain upon her was great, portrayed by extreme nervousness approaching hysteria, causing misapprehensions, extreme sensitivity to slights, or wants of politeness of consideration. I had the greatest sympathy for her and for Mr. Lincoln, who I'm sure felt deep anxiety for her. His manner towards her was always that of the most affectionate, so marked, so gentle, and unaffected that no one could see them together without being impressed by it. End quote. Anyone could see how fragile Mary's mental condition was, and witnessing the assassination of her beloved husband certainly did not help. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in the middle of a performance of Our American Cousin. Mary was understandably frantic at seeing her husband slumped over in the chair beside her. At the Peterson boarding house, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was furious at Mary's hysterical crying, and he kicked her out of the room where Lincoln lay unresponsive, the doctor certain that he was going to pass away. She paced the parlor alone, not knowing that this was the last time she was going to see her husband alive. Her understandable emotional response over such a traumatic situation led to great scrutiny from the public. They considered the way that she acted to be of an improper woman. The expectations for this era were ridiculously severe. Women were expected to tend the home and not seek attention or appear in public, but Mary enjoyed the spotlight. At this time, lavish displays of grief were normal, but for upper-class women, it was expected that they suppress their emotions. Mary had lost not only her husband, but 2 children. She was struggling and suffering with an incredibly fragile mental state, which psychologists now theorize to have been bipolar disorder. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, this disorder causes shifts in someone's mood, energy, and activity levels and concentration. A manic episode is defined by a period of energized or elated behavior. A depressive episode consists of sad, indifference, or a hopeless feeling. Jean Harvey Baker, a historian from Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland, said that in Mary's insanity trial, which I will get into in the next episode, said that one of the housekeepers that worked at the hotel that the Lincolns had stayed in had described Mary Todd as being, quote, often nervous and excitable. She was not like ladies in general, end quote. Previously in life, Mary was seen as unhinged, volatile. When she was younger, before Lincoln was president, she was portrayed as kind and intelligent, who was fun to party with. It was only after her husband became president that she began to become ill-tempered. Jen Christensen for CNN writes that, quote, in the White House fishbowl, the press constantly hounded her, and vicious gossips mocked her unflattering gowns, portraying her as a Confederate spy or a Western hick, end quote. Mary did not attend Lincoln's funeral. She was too distraught, and she was upset and angry that even Vice President Andrew Johnson didn't pay her a visit or write a note of sympathy to her. She even insinuated that he had been complicit in Lincoln's death and conspiring with Booth to kill him. And this is where I leave you for part 1. In part 2, we will be discussing Mary Todd Lincoln's obsession with spiritualism and her desire to speak to her husband from the grave one last time. Please subscribe to my podcast, and if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.